From perfect love to deadly deception, you're not ready for the climax. Stephanie was always considered the epitome of a perfect woman. She had everything: a cozy suburban home, two wonderful children, a great husband, James, who worked as a lawyer, and a life that seemed completely fulfilled. But behind this picture-perfect facade lay a reality no one could see. Their marriage had lasted 12 years. The first few years were filled with passion and romance, but over time, everything became routine. James, consumed by his work, spent more and more time at the office, leaving Stephanie home alone. She began to feel an emptiness that neither conversations with friends nor walks in the park could fill. One day, everything changed. It was at a charity gala organized for the local community. Stephanie didn't want to go, but her friend insisted. Among the crowd, a man caught her attention, tall, with piercing eyes and a confident smile. He introduced himself as Daniel. At first, their conversation was casual. He spoke about his work as an architect and his passion for photography. But soon, there was something in his gaze, something more than mere interest. Stephanie felt as though she was truly seen again. For the first time in a long while, she laughed and felt desired. Their conversation lingered, and when Stephanie realized how long they'd been talking, the evening was already coming to an end. Before parting, Daniel looked her directly in the eyes and said, "I don't know what keeps you here, but you deserve more." These words stayed with her even after she returned home. James, as usual, was in his office, working on another case. Stephanie quietly walked past, trying to hide her mixed emotions. The next day, she received a message. The sender, Daniel. "I'm sorry if I said anything inappropriate. You just made a strong impression on me. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Stephanie stared at her phone screen for a long time, hesitating. Finally, she replied, "Thank you. Maybe I just needed a conversation." That was the beginning of something that would change her life forever. Stephanie hit send and closed her phone, but deep down, she knew this step might be fatal. She tried to return to her routine, making dinner, checking her kids' homework, watching the series that always relaxed her. But nothing worked now. Thoughts of Daniel wouldn't leave her alone. The evening at home passed as usual. James came back late, greeted her briefly, and went straight to his office to immerse himself in work. Stephanie set the table and ate in silence, trying not to think about the message waiting on her phone. Once the kids were asleep, she finally dared to check it. The sender, Daniel. "Did you think about what I said?" Her heart raced. She knew she shouldn't reply, but the desire to feel that lightness she experienced during her conversation with Daniel won out. She replied, "Yes, maybe you're right." Daniel's message came almost instantly. "Let's meet. Tomorrow. Just to talk." She sat with her phone in her hands for a long time, staring at the message. Logic battled impulse, but the yearning to escape her routine ultimately won. "Okay," she wrote simply. The next day, with the kids at school and James at work, Stephanie dressed in a black suit she considered her favorite. It was elegant enough to make an impression, but subtle enough not to raise suspicions. At a cozy cafe downtown, Daniel was already waiting for her. He looked relaxed, confident, and his smile radiated warmth. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, just as it had the last time. They talked about life, hobbies, dreams, losing track of time. Daniel knew how to listen. His gaze was penetrating, and it felt like he could see all her hidden thoughts. Stephanie laughed, joked, and gradually opened up to him. "You're truly special," Daniel said at the end of their meeting, as they were about to leave. His voice was soft, and the touch of his hand was warm and reassuring. Those words left a mark on her heart. For the first time in many years, she felt noticed. She felt that her emotions mattered. She returned home late, a subtle smile lingering on her face. James, as always, was in his office and didn't even notice when she came in. Stephanie tried to act normal, but a wave of emotions swept over her. Thoughts swirled in her mind. Had she done the right thing? The next morning, as she prepared breakfast, a new message from Daniel arrived. "I can't stop thinking about your eyes. Give me a chance to show you something more." Stephanie froze for a moment, holding the phone in her hands. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as a question flashed through her mind. Should I reply or close this chapter forever? Stephanie stared at her phone for a long time. Her fingers involuntarily touched the keyboard, and she typed her response. All right. Where and when? The reply came almost instantly. My studio. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. I want to show you something important. The next day, Stephanie found an excuse. She told James she had a meeting with a friend, and a neighbor would pick up the kids. Slipping into a light dress with a neckline that highlighted her figure, she headed downtown. Her heart was pounding like a teenager's before a first date. Daniel's studio was spacious, bathed in warm light streaming through large windows. The walls were adorned with photographs, landscapes, portraits, abstract scenes. He greeted her with a glass of wine in hand. I'm glad you came, he said, his voice deep and soft. Stephanie smiled nervously. Her eyes scanned the photographs, lingering on a portrait of a woman with a sorrowful expression. Are these your works? She asked, breaking the tense silence. Yes. Each one has its own story. Just like you, he replied, stepping closer. Their conversation flowed easily, but the air between them was charged. Daniel talked about his travels, how photography became his passion, and the people he had met along the way. He moved closer as Stephanie paused in front of one of the portraits. You're incredible, Stephanie, he said softly, touching her hand. She felt a wave of warmth engulf her. His touch was gentle yet assured, and her heart raced. Daniel, she began, but her voice faltered. Shh, he whispered, leaning closer to her. He stopped just short of her face, giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and filled with forbidden passion. Her mind screamed that this was a mistake, but her body refused to listen. When the kiss ended, Stephanie was breathing heavily, looking at him. I don't know what's happening to me, she said, hiding her face in her hands. It's okay, he replied. We just allowed ourselves to be honest. She felt a mix of emotions, joy, guilt, excitement. For the first time in years, she felt alive again. But at the same time, she knew she was crossing a line that could destroy everything in her life. As she left the studio, her phone vibrated. A message from James. When will you be home? We need to talk. Stephanie stood in the hallway of her house, clutching her phone. James's message was simple, but every word struck her like a hammer. When will you be home? We need to talk. Her mind instantly filled with anxiety. What could he know? Perhaps it was just a coincidence. But she realized the risk was growing. She took a deep breath and replied, I'm almost home. Gathering all her strength, Stephanie headed home. A voice echoed in her head. Stay calm. Don't panic. Maybe it's not what you think. The door opened, and she entered the living room. James was waiting for her, sitting on the couch with his laptop beside him. His face was serious and focused. You're late, he said, looking up. The meeting with my friend ran long, she replied as calmly as possible, hiding her trembling fingers in her coat pockets. We need to talk, he said, pausing as if unsure how to proceed. I found something. Stephanie froze. What do you mean? James picked up the laptop and showed her the screen. It displayed their family bank account. Did you spend money from our joint card? I've noticed some unusual transactions recently, and some of them are at expensive places downtown. Stephanie exhaled with relief, but quickly realized she needed to stay alert. It's for a gift for you, James. For our anniversary. I didn't want you to find out about it, she said, trying to sound sincere. His face softened a bit, but suspicion still lingered in his eyes. All right, but if you're planning something, please don't do it alone. We're a team, he said with a smile. Stephanie nodded, but inside, she felt the weight of danger looming over her. Her lie might have worked this time, but next time, it could be much harder. As James returned to his work in the study, she grabbed her phone and messaged Daniel. We need to be careful. This is getting dangerous. Daniel responded almost immediately. Trust me. I'll take care of everything. Her thoughts were chaotic, but at that moment, Stephanie realized the choice had already been made. She had gone too far to turn back. Stephanie stared at a message from an unknown number, her hands trembling. I know what you're doing. Soon, everyone else will too. Her heart pounded so hard, She could hear it in her ears. Who could it be? James? But he had just believed her lie. Daniel? Impossible. He had no reason to send this. She hid the phone, took a deep breath, and decided to act as if nothing had happened. All morning, she tried to maintain her routine. Making breakfast, helping the kids get ready for school, and then returning to the kitchen to have coffee. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a new call. It was the same number as the message. She stared at the screen, her heart racing. After a few moments of hesitation, Stephanie answered. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice shaky despite her attempt to sound confident. "You shouldn't have gone this far," said a low, muffled voice. "Your secrets won't stay hidden for long." The call ended abruptly. Stephanie lowered the phone, her body drenched in cold sweat. She had to do something, but she didn't know what. Grabbing her phone, she texted Daniel, "I'm getting strange messages. Someone knows about us." His response came almost immediately. "Let's meet tonight. We'll figure this out together." The entire day, Stephanie was on edge. She couldn't focus on anything and kept checking her phone, but no more messages came. At 7 p.m., she met Daniel at a small bar far from familiar places. He looked calm, but his eyes betrayed concern. "Is someone threatening you?" he asked, taking her hand. "I don't know, but they know something about us. I'm scared it might be James or someone he knows." Daniel leaned in closer, his voice serious. "You need to trust me. I won't let anyone hurt you." Their conversation was interrupted by a call. It was the same number again. Seeing her fear, Daniel took the phone from her hand. "Hello," he said firmly, his voice steady and confident. After a few moments of silence, the call disconnected. Daniel handed the phone back to Stephanie. "They're afraid. That's good. But we need to be cautious." Later that evening, when Stephanie returned home, she sensed someone was in the living room. James was sitting in a chair, holding her phone. "We need to talk," he said, looking up at her. Stephanie froze in the doorway. James was holding her phone, and her heart sank. But he remained silent, and his face showed no accusation, only tension. "We need to talk," he repeated. Stephanie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. What does he know? What has he seen? Raced through her mind. She slowly entered the room, trying to appear calm. "What's wrong?" she asked, keeping her voice as even as possible. James looked up at her. "We're drifting apart, Steph. I can see it. You've changed. I know I've been busy with work, but I don't want to lose us." He paused. "I think we need to spend more time together." Stephanie felt her heart calm slightly, but his words also brought a wave of guilt. "You're right," she said, sitting across from him. "We should try." James nodded and handed her the phone. He didn't know anything, but how much longer could she keep it all hidden? That night, Stephanie barely slept. Her phone vibrated under the pillow. A message from Daniel. "I've decided we won't wait any longer. You're important to me, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep us together." The next day, with the kids at school and James at work, Daniel called. "Stephanie," his voice was calm but firm. "I can't let this continue. We're meeting tonight. It's important." "Daniel," she began, but he cut her off. "It'll be fine. Just trust me." She hesitated, but eventually agreed. She had to know what he was planning. Daniel's studio was bathed in soft light, but this time, the atmosphere was different, tense. Daniel met her at the door, gently taking her hand. "We need to put an end to this," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked, feeling a growing sense of unease. Daniel led her to a table where a phone was lying. "I've found a way to make sure no one finds out about us," he said, pressing a few buttons on the screen. A video appeared on the phone. James in his office, working at his computer. Stephanie flinched. "What is this?" she whispered. "Surveillance footage from his office," Daniel replied calmly. "He's not perfect either. I've gathered some things that could distract him if necessary." Stephanie felt a chill run down her spine. "You've been spying on him?" "No," Daniel denied. "I just want to protect us. If he suspects anything, this will be our defense." "But this isn't right," she said, stepping back. "And what is right, Stephanie?" His voice sharpened. "Do you want to stay with a man who doesn't even notice you? Or give us a chance?" Her thoughts were chaotic. She didn't know how to respond. James sat in the living room, his face focused, his gaze cold. In front of him was her laptop, its screen glowing and casting light across the room. Stephanie walked into the house, not noticing him at first. Her mind was tangled after her conversation with Daniel. But when she saw James, sitting motionless like a statue with her laptop, she knew things had gone too far. "What are you doing?" Her voice trembled as she shrugged off her coat. James looked up at her. In his eyes, there was something new. Not anger, but deep, crushing disappointment. "Stephanie," he began, his voice quiet but tense. "Why?" She froze, not knowing what to say. "I found this," he gestured toward the screen, where messages with Daniel were open. A few words, a few phrases, and it was all clear. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her heart pounding so hard she thought he might hear it. "Isn't it?" James stood and stepped closer, stopping just a few steps away. "Then tell me what it is. Explain why you're telling another man. You're important to me. Explain why you're hiding this from me." Stephanie tried to gather herself, but her thoughts scattered like shards of glass. "It's just a conversation," she finally said, trying to sound convincing. James shook his head, his smile bitter. "Just a conversation? Stephanie, we've been married for 12 years. I know you, and I know when you're hiding something." He stepped back, as if he was going to leave, but then turned back around. "Do you know what hurts the most? It's not that you betrayed me. It's that you didn't even think it was worth telling me you were unhappy, that you were struggling. You just left." His words hit her harder than any shout could have. She felt her eyes fill with tears, but she couldn't allow herself to cry. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she finally said. "It happened because I felt alone. You were always busy, James. I thought you didn't notice me anymore." "And did you think I noticed myself?" His voice rose. "Do you think it was easy for me? I was working for us, for the kids, so you could have this life." He walked to the window and stopped, staring into the darkness. "And now what?" he asked, not turning to face her. Stephanie didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him that they could fix this, that she would do anything to bring their life back to what it was. But was that true? Did she want that? Suddenly, her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. A message from Daniel. "What's happening? Are you okay?" James turned around and saw her holding the phone. "Is it him?" James asked, his voice quiet but laden with pain. Stephanie nodded silently. "Then choose," he said. "I'm not going to fight for you anymore, Stephanie. If you want him, go. But if you want to keep our family, this ends today." His words hung in the air. She felt her heart tighten under the weight of the decision before her. A knock at the door was sudden and loud, breaking the tense silence between Stephanie and James like a thunderclap on a clear day. Stephanie turned toward the front door, her heart freezing. James, his expression filled with anger and disappointment, moved forward. "Don't," Stephanie whispered, but he didn't hear her. He opened the door. Standing there was Daniel, his expression serious but confident. His eyes met James's in a tense, silent exchange. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice cold as ice. Daniel glanced at Stephanie, who stood a few steps behind. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear. "My name is Daniel," he replied calmly but firmly. "I'm the one you already know about." James flinched at the words. He turned to Stephanie. "Did you invite him here?" His voice rose, laced with desperation. "No," she replied quickly, her voice trembling. "I didn't know he was coming." "I came because I want the truth to come out," Daniel interjected. "We need to resolve this." "We?" James frowned. "There is no we. There is only me and my wife." Daniel stepped forward, his face inches from James's. "Then why is your wife seeking understanding from another man?" he asked quietly, but his voice carried an edge of steel. James lunged forward, but Stephanie managed to step between them just in time. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice louder than she expected. Both men froze, staring at her. Her hands trembled as she raised them in front of herself. "This won't solve anything. You're both talking about me like I'm not even here. But this is my life." James and Daniel looked at her silently. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air could explode at any moment. "If this is your life," James finally said, his voice low but filled with pain, "then tell me, do you want to stay with me or with him?" Stephanie sighed, feeling her heart torn between the two men. But before she could answer, Daniel spoke. "James, I understand that you and Stephanie are going through a crisis. But this isn't just her issue. This is your shared life. If you're willing, we can figure this out together." James looked stunned. "Together? You seriously think I'll sit here and talk to you? And what will you do?" Daniel replied. "Start a fight? That'll only make things worse." Stephanie sank into a chair, her energy drained. She couldn't take it anymore. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly. Her words silenced both men. They looked at her, and the tension in the room began to subside. Suddenly, a phone rang. James frowned, pulled out his phone, and glanced at the screen. His expression changed instantly, and he answered the call. "What?" he said, his voice filled with urgency. He listened for a few seconds, and then ended the call. "It's the office. There's a problem. My entire email account has been hacked," he said, looking at both Stephanie and Daniel. Her heart froze. She realized the situation had escalated far beyond a personal conflict. James stood still, clutching the phone in his hand. His face was dark with anger and tension. "Someone hacked my email," he repeated, almost to himself, but his gaze bored into Daniel. "I want to know if it was you." "Me?" Daniel frowned, crossing his arms. "That's absurd. I would never do something like that." Stephanie sat silently, her heart pounding wildly. She tried to gather her thoughts, but the situation seemed completely out of control. "If it were me, why would I do it?" Daniel continued. "To put myself at risk? To endanger Stephanie?" James stared at him with suspicion, but said nothing. His phone vibrated again, and he quickly answered. "What do you mean all the files are gone?" he said into the phone, his voice tense. "Those were confidential materials." Stephanie felt the tension in the room intensify. She couldn't understand how this had happened, but something told her it wasn't a coincidence. James ended the call and threw his phone onto the table. "This isn't just a hack," he said, looking directly at Stephanie. "Someone is deliberately targeting me." Daniel clenched his fists. "If that's true, who could it be? Do you have enemies?" James sighed and rubbed his forehead. "In my business, there are always people who want to cause harm. But right now, this feels connected to you," he said, turning to Stephanie. "Are you involved in this?" Stephanie lifted her head, her voice trembling. "No, I don't know who's behind this." But even to her own ears, her words didn't sound convincing. The thought spun in her mind. Could it be Daniel? He seemed so confident, so calm. But could she fully trust him? Before anyone could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. All three turned toward the sound. Standing there was a courier holding an envelope. "Mr. James?" the courier asked. James nodded, and the courier handed him the envelope. James opened it, and a photograph fell out. The image showed Stephanie and Daniel in a bar, their faces close together. James froze. His hand clenched the photograph, and he looked up at them, his face filled with anger. "What is this?" he shouted. Stephanie was silent, her lips dry, her heart frozen. Daniel stepped forward. "Someone is playing with us," he said, his voice remaining calm. "James, you have to understand. This is a threat not just to you. It's a threat to all of us." "A threat?" James scoffed bitterly. "The only threat in this room is you." Daniel shook his head and stepped closer to Stephanie. "We need to leave," he said softly to her. "Leave?" James tilted his head back, laughing coldly. "Is that your plan? To run away? That's it?" Daniel didn't respond. He reached for Stephanie's hand, but she stepped back. "I can't," she whispered. James turned to her. "Can't what? Choose between us?" Her tears welled up, but she held them back. "This is bigger than the three of us," she finally said. "Someone is blackmailing us." Her phone vibrated again. She picked it up, and a new message appeared on the screen. "You will all pay if you don't do what I say." Stephanie held the phone tightly, her eyes fixed on the message. The words felt like poison, seeping into her mind. She looked up at James and Daniel. Her husband's face was red with anger, but fear flickered in his eyes. Daniel, on the other hand, looked concerned but remarkably composed. "We can't stay here," Daniel said, his voice steady and firm. "It's not safe." "And where exactly do you plan to take us?" James snapped, gripping the photograph in his hand. "Do you think I'm going to leave my house because of you?" "This isn't about me," Daniel replied. "It's about her," he nodded toward Stephanie. "And about you too, if you haven't figured that out yet." Stephanie felt her heart tighten. She didn't know what to do, but she was certain of one thing. Staying here was far too dangerous. "I need to think," she whispered. "We don't have time to think." Daniel snapped. "Right now, the only thing that matters is your life." James laughed bitterly. "Her life? What about mine? You think you can just barge in here and start making the rules?" "No one's making the rules," Daniel replied calmly. "But we both know this situation is bigger than us." Stephanie felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Enough!" she shouted. "I can't take this anymore." Both men fell silent, staring at her. "I'm leaving," she said, gripping her phone tightly. "If either of you wants to come along, fine. But I'm not waiting." James took a step toward her. "Stephanie, you can't just run away. That won't solve anything. And staying here, waiting to be destroyed, will?" She shot back, her voice growing stronger. Daniel grabbed his jacket. "I know a place where we'll be safe," he said. James reluctantly nodded. "If you think I'm letting you drag her away, you're wrong. I'm coming with you." The road was dark and empty. They drove in Daniel's car, and the tension between them was suffocating. James sat in the passenger seat, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the road. "Where are we going?" he finally asked. "To a place I rent for work," Daniel replied. "No cameras, no internet. It's safe." Stephanie stayed silent, staring out the window, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled so far out of control. Just a month ago, her life had seemed predictable and stable. Now, it felt like a chaotic whirlwind. Suddenly, her phone vibrated again. She looked at the screen. "I know where you are. The game has only just begun." "Someone's following us," she whispered. Daniel slammed on the brakes. "That's impossible. How could they find us?" "Maybe it's you," James shouted suddenly. "Maybe this is all your game." "Don't you dare," Daniel retorted, his voice icy. "I'm trying to protect her while you sit back and do nothing." "Protect her?" James leaned closer, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Or are you just trying to take her from me?" "Enough!" Stephanie screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I can't take this anymore." She jumped out of the car, standing on the side of the road, surrounded by darkness. Her hands were trembling, and her thoughts were in disarray. Daniel and James got out as well. "We can't leave her here," Daniel said. "Or maybe we should let her make her choice," James replied, his voice tinged with sadness. Headlights appeared in the distance, speeding toward them. Stephanie froze on the roadside, unable to move. Her body was paralyzed with fear, and her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of her chest. "Get in the car. Now!" Daniel shouted, grabbing her arm. James lunged toward her as well but stumbled and fell. Daniel quickly lifted Stephanie, practically shoving her into the back seat, and sped off, leaving the other car behind. "They won't stop," Daniel muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. James sat beside him, breathing heavily. "Who could it be?" he asked, but no one answered. Stephanie clenched the seat beneath her as her phone vibrated again. She glanced at the screen. "You won't escape. I know where you're going." "They know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They know where we are." "How?" James spun around to face her. "Is someone leaking information?" "No," Daniel snapped. "There's a tracker. They must have planted it on the car. Then why didn't you remove it?" James raised his voice. "I didn't think they'd go this far," Daniel shot back. Suddenly, the car pursuing them appeared in the rearview mirror, its headlights glaring through the back window. It moved aggressively, honking and edging dangerously close. "Hold on," Daniel shouted, making a sharp turn onto a narrow forest road. The car sped along the dark, uneven path, but the pursuers didn't back off. James grabbed his phone, trying to call the police, but the signal was too weak. "No service," he yelled. Daniel gritted his teeth, his eyes fixed on the road. "We have no choice. We need to split up." "What?" Stephanie exclaimed. "If we stay together, they'll find us," Daniel explained. "I'll lead them away while you two hide here." James didn't look convinced. "And leave her with you? Are you joking?" "I'm not joking," Daniel said sharply. "This is our only chance." The car skidded to a halt at the roadside, and Daniel jumped out, opening the door for Stephanie. "Go," he commanded. Stephanie climbed out with James, her legs trembling. Daniel got back into the driver's seat and, without waiting, sped off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. The pursuing car followed. Stephanie and James were left alone in the forest. The darkness was nearly absolute, and the sounds of the night felt ominous. "Where to now?" she asked, looking around nervously. James grabbed her hand. "We need to find a place to hide." They moved through dense underbrush, branches scratching their arms and faces. Their breathing was heavy, but neither dared to stop. Suddenly, James froze. "Quiet," he whispered. Stephanie held her breath, straining to hear. In the distance, the sound of an engine rumbled faintly. "They're coming back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to hide," James decided, pulling her toward a nearby tree. They pressed themselves against the trunk, holding their breath. The car's headlights flickered through the trees as it stopped nearby. Several men emerged, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they split up to search. "They're looking for us," Stephanie whispered. James nodded. "We need to move quietly." They crept low to the ground, each step feeling agonizingly loud. Stephanie's heart pounded, and every snap of a twig beneath her feet felt like a gunshot in the silence. James grabbed her hand and whispered, "If anything happens, run. I'll hold them off." "No," she whispered back, tears welling in her eyes. "We go together." Suddenly, a flashlight beam swept in their direction. "Over here!" a man shouted, and the sound of footsteps thundered toward them. Stephanie ran as fast as she could, nearly tripping over roots jutting from the ground. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She glanced over her shoulder, searching for James, but all she saw was darkness. The distant flashlights of the pursuers flickered through the dense trees, and their voices echoed in the forest. "She went this way," one of the men yelled. Stephanie stopped for a moment, leaning against a tree to catch her breath. Her lungs burned, but she knew she couldn't afford to rest. Suddenly, her foot slipped on something slick, and she fell hard to the ground, her body colliding with a sharp rock. Pain shot through her like a wave, but she pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle any sound. She lay motionless, listening to the crunch of footsteps growing nearer. In the distance, there was a faint rustling. She froze, barely daring to breathe. One of the men moved closer, his flashlight sweeping erratically, illuminating the space around him. "She's not here," he said into his radio. "Keep searching." Stephanie felt a slight release of tension, but only for a moment. She rose again, moving as quietly as possible. Meanwhile, James was heading in the opposite direction. His breathing was heavy, but he didn't stop. He needed to find a way to divert the threat away from Stephanie. Hearing the shouts of the men drawing closer, he quickly made a decision. He pulled off his jacket and hung it on a tree branch, creating a decoy. Then he crouched behind thick bushes, gripping a heavy rock in his hand. His heart pounded wildly, but he remained steady, ready to act. "There's something here," one of the pursuers shouted, spotting the jacket. Two men approached the decoy, examining it with their flashlights. "Is it hers?" one asked. "No, it's a man's jacket," the other replied. James seized the moment, darting out of his hiding spot and hurling the rock at one of their flashlights. The light went out, plunging the forest into darkness. "Damn it! Who's there?" one of the men yelled. James bolted in another direction, drawing their attention away. His goal was to buy Stephanie enough time to escape. Stephanie continued moving forward until she heard another rustle nearby. Her heart stopped when she saw a flashlight beam heading straight toward her. "Stop!" a man shouted, his silhouette appearing in front of her. She backed away until her back hit a tree. "Don't do this," she said, trying to sound confident. The man stepped closer, holding something in his hand. "You think you can just run away?" he said coldly. "This isn't a game." Suddenly, James emerged from the shadows, tackling the pursuer from behind. The object in the man's hand fell to the ground as they struggled. "Run, Steph!" James shouted, holding the attacker back. Stephanie hesitated, but then grabbed the object, a flashlight, from the ground. She ran toward James, aiming to help. The man shoved James aside and reached for Stephanie's wrist, trying to stop her. But James, summoning all his strength, pushed him back. The man stumbled and fell unconscious. "We need to go," James said, breathing heavily. Suddenly, the sound of another vehicle reached them. Their hearts froze again, but this time it was Daniel. He stepped out of the car, holding a flashlight and what looked like a radio. "Are you two okay?" he asked, scanning them with concern. "Barely," Stephanie replied, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded. "They're gone. I led the others away. We need to find a safe place until morning." "How did you find us?" James asked, though his tone was less hostile. "I tracked their route," Daniel explained. "We have some time, but not much." The darkness outside the car windows felt suffocating, like a trap. Daniel drove in silence, gripping the wheel tightly. Stephanie sat in the back, feeling the tension between the two men fill the air. Her phone still displayed the last message she'd received. "You thought it was over? This is just the beginning." "What now?" James finally broke the silence, his voice low. "We'll find a safe place and wait out the night," Daniel replied without taking his eyes off the road. "A safe place?" James scoffed. "You already led us into a trap once. Why should I trust you now?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "Do you have a better plan? If you want, you can get out right now." "You've been a threat from the start," James shot back, leaning forward. "This entire situation is because of you. Do you have a better plan? If you want, you can get out right now," Daniel said firmly. "You've been a threat from the start," James shot back, leaning forward. "This whole situation is your fault." "You don't understand what we're caught up in," Daniel retorted sharply. "This is bigger than our personal issues. You dragged her into this." James turned abruptly to Stephanie. "And you let it happen." Stephanie felt her chest tighten at his words. "That's not fair," she said quietly, though her voice wavered. "Not fair," his voice rose. "What's not fair is that my wife chose to trust a stranger over me." "Maybe because you were always too busy with yourself," she suddenly shouted, her voice cracking. "You didn't even notice how lonely I felt in this marriage." James froze, his expression shifting, but he quickly regained his composure. "That's no excuse," he said coldly. Daniel pulled the car to a stop near an abandoned shed at the edge of the forest. "We can't keep going like this," he said, stepping out of the car. "If we don't learn to work together, we won't survive." James followed, slamming the door so hard it echoed like a gunshot. "You taught her to lie," he accused, stepping closer to Daniel. "And now you want to tell me how to save my family?" "I'm trying to protect both of you," Daniel replied, his voice calm. "But if you keep this up, you'll destroy everything." "Do you even hear yourself?" James growled, moving inches from Daniel's face. "Enough," Stephanie yelled, stepping out of the car. Both men turned to face her. "We're in this together," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the desperation in her eyes. "If you want to fight, do it later. Right now, there's a bigger threat." "She's right," Daniel finally said, stepping back. "We have a few hours to figure out our next move." James retreated in silence, though his eyes remained cold. Inside the shed, the air was damp and chilly. The three of them sat in the dim light of a flashlight, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "I want the truth," James said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Is there more between you two than just those messages?" Stephanie froze, unsure of what to say. "I'm waiting." His voice grew quieter, but somehow even more intimidating. Daniel interjected. "You should focus on how we're going to get out of this." "I don't need your advice," James snapped. "I'm asking my wife." Stephanie finally spoke. "I don't know what you want me to say," she admitted. "But right now, it doesn't matter. We need to survive. James let out a bitter laugh, but said nothing more. Suddenly, there was a knock at the shed door. The sound echoed through the tense silence, making them all jump. "Open up if you want to avoid trouble," a voice called from outside. It was unfamiliar but confident. Daniel frowned, gripping a heavy stick he had found in the shed. "Don't move," he whispered. "What kind of joke is this?" James muttered, his fists clenching. Stephanie's heart pounded wildly, threatening to burst from her chest. She glanced between the two men, trying to decide what to do. Slowly, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a stranger dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a cap. He wasn't armed but held a small box in his hands. "We need to talk," the man said calmly, his eyes scanning the trio. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, gripping the stick tightly. The man stepped forward and placed the box on the floor. "I was sent by those in charge of this," he replied. "I'm here to help you understand how serious this is." "In charge of what?" Stephanie interjected, her voice steadier than she felt. The stranger smirked slightly, as if her question amused him. "None of your choices have been random," he said, opening the box. Inside were photographs and a few documents. He pulled out a photograph and handed it to Stephanie. "See for yourself." Stephanie hesitated before taking it. Her eyes widened as she saw James in the photo. He was sitting in a restaurant with another woman, their hands touching. The expression on his face was painfully familiar. It was the same look he used to give her. "What is this?" Her voice cracked as she looked up at the man. James turned away, his face tense. "It's an old story," he said finally. "Old story?" Her voice rose to a near shout. "Is this what you've been hiding from me?" Daniel cut in, his tone sharp. "Stephanie, now's not the time for this. We need to figure out what's going on here." The man tilted his head, watching them as though they were actors in a play. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," he said, pulling out another document. "Here's what you really need to know." He handed them a sheet of paper. It was part of a report detailing illegal financial transactions connected to James' company. "Did you know about this?" Stephanie asked, her eyes locked on James. James let out a heavy sigh. "I was trying to fix it," he admitted. "They were blackmailing me. If I didn't comply, it would have put our entire family at risk. And now you've put all of us in danger," Daniel said, stepping toward him. "You're no better," James snapped. "You dragged her into this mess." "Enough," Stephanie shouted, waving her hand to silence them. "You both made mistakes. But right now, we need to find a way out of this." The silence in the shed was deafening after the stranger's words. He stood in the center, his confidence radiating an almost palpable power. Stephanie, James, and Daniel froze, each of them processing his final statement. "This is just the beginning. We need to talk," the man said calmly, his gaze sweeping over the trio. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, gripping the stick tightly in his hands. The man stepped forward and placed a box on the floor. "I was sent by those in charge of this," he replied. "I'm here to make sure you understand how serious this is." "In charge of what?" Stephanie interjected, her voice steadier than she felt. The stranger smiled faintly, as if her question amused him. "None of your decisions have been random," he said, opening the box. Inside were photographs and several documents. He pulled out a photograph and handed it to Stephanie. "Take a look." Stephanie hesitated before taking it. Her eyes widened as she saw James in the photo. He was sitting in a restaurant with another woman, their hands touching. The expression on his face was painfully familiar. It was the same look he used to give her. "What is this?" Her voice cracked as she looked up at the man. James turned away, his face tense. "It's an old story," he said finally. "Old story?" Her voice rose to a near shout. "Is this what you've been hiding from me?" Daniel cut in, his tone sharp. "Stephanie, now's not the time for this. We need to figure out what's going on here." The man tilted his head, watching them as though they were actors in a play. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," he said, pulling out another document. "Here's what you really need to know." He handed them a sheet of paper. It was part of a report detailing illegal financial transactions connected to James' company. "Did you know about this?" Stephanie asked, her eyes locked on James. James let out a heavy sigh. I was trying to fix it, he admitted. They were blackmailing me. If I didn't comply, it would have put our entire family at risk. And now you've put all of us in danger, Daniel said, stepping toward him. You're no better, James snapped. You dragged her into this mess. Enough, Stephanie shouted, waving her hand to silence them. You both made mistakes. But right now, we need to find a way out of this. The silence in the shed was thick after the stranger's words. He stood in the center, his confidence radiating an almost palpable power. Stephanie, James, and Daniel froze, each processing his final statement. This is just the beginning. What does that mean? Stephanie asked, stepping forward. Her voice was firmer than she felt. The man glanced at her with a faint smile. It means every choice you've made has been part of a larger game. Your betrayal, your decision to meet here. All of it was planned. Planned by whom? Daniel demanded sharply, his fists clenching. By the people you both owe, the man said, shifting his gaze from James to Daniel. Do you think I'm here for the money? No, this is personal. I don't know what you're talking about, James replied, his voice tense. The man tilted his head, as though James' response amused him. Really? Have you forgotten how you promised to protect your company while making those deals? And you, he turned to Daniel, how you exploited others' weaknesses to get what you wanted. Stephanie felt as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Are you saying this is all because of them? Her voice broke. No, the man said with a sigh. This is because of you. Stephanie froze, her heart skipping a beat. What? You were the catalyst for everything. Your meeting with Daniel forced James to make the decisions he did. Your weakness became our advantage. James and Daniel both turned to look at her. It's not her fault, Daniel said. We all make mistakes. But not all mistakes cost lives, the man replied, his voice growing colder. So what do you want? James asked. Compensation, the man said. Otherwise, you'll lose far more than your money or reputation. What guarantees do we have that you'll leave us alone after this? Daniel asked. None, the man replied. But trust me, you don't have a choice. Stephanie stepped closer, her eyes brimming with tears. Is this really the only way out? The man looked at her with a hint of pity. There's always a way out, but it's not always the one you'd like to see. James and Daniel exchanged a glance. A silent decision passed between them. We won't let you control us, James said, his voice growing stronger. And if you think we'll just give in, then you don't know us, Daniel added. The man smiled faintly. Your courage is admirable, but it won't save you. Suddenly, James lunged forward, knocking the man off his feet. Daniel joined in, pinning him to the ground. Stephanie, James shouted. Grab his phone and find out who's behind this. Stephanie scrambled to pick up the man's phone and began scrolling through his messages. She found a string of conversations detailing a plan that included both James and Daniel's names. This is bigger than we thought, she whispered. Stephanie sent the evidence to the police while James and Daniel kept the man restrained. Soon, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police arrived and took the stranger into custody. This isn't over, he said as they put him in the car. You'll all pay for this. Stephanie looked at James and Daniel. We need to finish this together, she said, her voice resolute. James nodded. But not today. Daniel agreed. The next few weeks were intense. The police uncovered a massive criminal network that implicated both James' business and Daniel's past. Stephanie, though initially shocked, found the strength to move forward. She no longer viewed her life as a series of mistakes. This was a new beginning. What do you think? Did Stephanie make the right choice by teaming up with James and Daniel to solve the problem? Or should she have taken a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments.